Hi, I'm Dom, Vice President of the Student Veterans Organization here at Finger Lakes Community College. We have covered a lot of topics related to mental health in this series. In today's episode, my classmate, Blythe Hodgson, tackles one more: resilience. A lot of research has been done to help us understand what it takes to overcome hard times and challenges. Blythe had an opportunity to talk about resilience with Dr. Joseph Fantigrossi, Director of Intervention and Professional Development with Finger Lakes Community Schools. Let's check out their conversation.
Hi Joe, thank you so much again for coming in to talk with me about resilience.
I'm glad to be here.
I know you do a lot of work with Finger Lakes Community Schools to help people understand and develop resilience. That tells me you don't have to be born with it?
I think that's one of the common myths for that topic, is that either you're resilient or not resilient, and it's the skill that you've been born with. Mm-hmm. The truth is that some people can build resilience in a more simple way. Mm-hmm. If you come from a family of close relationships, if you come from a stable environment where your needs are consistently met, resilience may be a bit easier for you because your foundation, particularly your brain foundation, is stronger. But we now know that the brain has a plasticity to it, that it's malleable, that it can change over time. And because of that, even if you didn't start with that awesome structural foundation, that you can fill in the gaps, any holes in that foundation, and build upon it as you grow, whether that be as a child or as an adult. So resilience is something that can be worked on and that people can improve upon.
So resilience is kind of the concept of how well you can overcome challenges, right? So why do some people manage to move on really easily from an accident, while others might feel overwhelmed and not be able to cope as well?
That can be based on a number of factors, but the one factor I'll highlight for this conversation is the concept of experiences.
Okay.
And so particularly experiences before the age of 18. There has been a great deal of study around what is referred to as ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. And really that study taught us that when a young person has difficult or challenging experiences in their childhood, that creates the likelihood that resilience will be more difficult for them.
Okay.
And so the difference that you see for some people coming through obstacles easier than other people is really that concept of where did they begin. So to say that you ran the race faster than me, but you started 100 feet in front of me at the beginning of the race, that's not really true. It's just I had more distance to cover.
Right.
And so a young person who has experienced more challenges in their youth has more building to do to become resilient before they get to that same spot.
Okay, gotcha. So sometimes when trauma happens in childhood, because it's impacted the person so much at a young age, it's harder to develop the skills it takes to overcome it in the future.
And it takes more energy to do so.
Okay.
So it's not a level playing field.
A lot of people say what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but that's not the case.
Well, I think it's an oversimplifying of that concept. It makes us feel better generally that hard work equals success. The truth is that you and I could both work at the same level and one of us could be more successful, because that concept of overcoming challenge is not just a one-part question. It doesn't have just one avenue. There is, the work ethic is important and it has its place. But again, if you're starting from a different spot than I'm starting, If I ask you to climb 10 feet, and I need to climb 10 feet, but I ask you to start from a 10-foot hole in the ground to climb that 10 feet, now I'm asking you to climb 20 feet.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that people forget, is that we're not all starting on the same playing field. And that really is the difference between doing something for equality versus doing something for equity. If we're all equal, then having the same rules and the same expectations makes sense, right? But we're not starting at all the same ground. So for equity's sake, we have to understand that people are starting at different places, and we have to meet people where they're at.
Okay, so all these concepts sound semi-complicated. If you were to teach somebody how to build skills of resilience, how would you teach it?
So you would get different answers from different people, but we at Finger Lakes Community Schools have worked a great deal on how do we make this somewhat complex topic digestible, make it make sense for everyone. And through that work, we call it the collaboration arch.
Okay.
And ARCH is an acronym for attachment, regulation, self-regulation, competency, and health. And so what we say is that if we're going to help someone build the skills of resiliency, they have to be strong in those 4 categories. Attachment, the A in ARCH for attachment, really is the idea that we gain resilience by having caring relationships with others, or being part of a group or team that we're counted on for, and that we're an integral part of. And so for some of our young people, and as they grow into adulthood, there's a feeling of isolation and loneliness. And loneliness works against resilience, because then what are you fighting for if you're alone? And so attachment is the idea that if we have at least one caring relationship, we're able to be more resilient.
Okay, so having people around you there to support you, that does help, but is it also part of human nature maybe that we need others in our lives to be able to be successful in resilience?
Yes, and attachment is a core human need. Even people who are the most introverted still need to have loving, caring relationships to feel fulfilled. And that is a cornerstone to building resilience. The R in ARCH is for regulation, but really it's self-regulation. It just didn't make as much sense in the acronym. And really the importance of self-regulation is we all feel emotions. We all have times when we're angry or sad or afraid or happy. The question is not the emotions we have, it's the impact those emotions have on our actions. And as we grow into adulthood, it is really critical that we have some mechanism, some coping skills to manage those emotions. Because generally speaking, up until you get out of high school, people are somewhat patient with you if you're not the best at regulating your emotions. But once you move into adulthood, there's less and less patience. So if you get a job and you have an anger problem and you go off on your boss, generally speaking, your boss is not going to be really patient, say, well, he's just not, or she's not very good at self-regulation.
Right.
No, they're going to fire you. And so we really believe that to help a young person and then an adult find success in their lives, they have to be able to recognize how they're feeling, name it, what is this that I'm feeling, and then have some sort of coping strategy, or hopefully strategies, to work with it. So what is something we teach people when they're angry? We teach them to count backwards from 10. We teach them to take deep breaths. Our youngest people, our kindergartners, our first graders, we say belly breaths.
Yeah.
Take a deep breath so your belly comes out, and then exhale. And we teach positive self-talk. Like, yeah, this is really crappy right now, but I'm going to get through it, and I'm not going to make this worse by having an action that's going to hurt someone else. So that's the regulation piece of the arch.
So would you say that counseling would be a helpful tool for somebody who wants to work on their regulation?
Yes, any form of therapy will help you with those coping strategies.
Gotcha.
And it's something that I know at times in our world has had this stigma that there's something wrong with it or that it's a weakness. And I will tell you that one of the quickest ways to build resilience is to learn how to self-regulate. And the fastest way to self-regulation is to learn how to self-regulate from an expert. And a therapist is an expert in that.
So what about the third element you mentioned,
So,
competency?
Yep, so the C in competency really talks about, can we help someone identify what they're good at and what they're passionate about?
So is that something like having a skill like playing an instrument or knowing like geometry proofs or something?
Yes, it can be. It can be academically based. It can also be something much simpler. If you know that you're good at cooking, if you know that you're good at being a listening friend, it's identifying what skills or strengths do I bring to the table. Because if I know that, then I've built my own self-worth.
So from personal experience, I know a lot of teens can find it difficult to find what they're good at, what they're passionate about. What are some ways that teens and young adults can find things that they're competent at?
And I think that's a question that's answer has changed significantly, particularly over the last decade. Because we used to look solely at formal education as a way to learn what we're good at and build our skills. And that's a piece of it. Whether it be a high school or a college setting or some certificate program, there is true value in learning your competence through formal education. But we've also realized more recently that there's real value in informal education. And the access that people now have to YouTube channels that focus on specific skill sets, the access to internet sites from across the world that explain complex, what were thought to be complex process. I'll give you something as simple as changing the oil in your car. That is a skill.
Yeah.
But now it's a skill that's well documented on the internet. So if you truly want to do that on your own and don't want to pay someone else to do it, you can find thousands of videos explained in dozens of languages of how to change your oil. So competence is now, I would say, more within the grasp of everyone than it was previously, because knowledge is more equitably available to everyone because of the advent of websites and YouTube and other social media avenues.
So in terms of resilience, you're saying that competency or finding some small thing that you're good at can help you in the long term with your self-confidence, and you'll be able to deal with big problems and challenges that you face in your life?
Yes, I think you put it well. It's a building block.
Got it.
It is, if you think back to your own experiences, it is really hard to feel good about yourself if you can't look back and say, well, I'm good at this, or I think I'm pretty good at that, and sometimes we focus on the biggest pieces. Like, I have to be really good at algebra.
Right.
The truth is that as we get older and as we move into adulthood, it's the smaller pieces that make the most impact. I'm a good friend because I don't jump to judgment, but I listen to what my friend is saying first. That's a true skill to actually listen to what someone else is saying instead of preparing what you're going to say in response. And some people just wouldn't recognize that they have that skill, and that's really valuable in not only building a relationship with your friend, but helping your friend find their way to their own competency.
Okay, so it could even be something as small as acknowledging that you're really good at cooking an egg. That's something you're good at.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And that competency builds on itself. Once you know you've conquered one skill, then you have the confidence to believe you can conquer other skills as well.
Okay, so now we talk about the last element. What
So,
does health mean?
Yeah, and health is a recent addition to the research.
Okay.
So the initial concept was ARC, A-R-C, but health was added several years ago by Lesley University. And their focus was primarily on physical health and the importance of physical health. And in a simplistic way, I would say that our physical health, and therefore our mental health, is really based on a three-sided triangle. One side of that triangle is nutrition.
All right.
What are our patterns, our habits, and are we correctly fueling our bodies in what we eat? The second of that three-sided triangle would be sleep. People often overlook the importance of what does our body do when we sleep? What are our habits? Because now we have decent research available to us that says that when we develop a sleep deficit, it has a negative physical impact on us because it doesn't allow our body to repair itself. But it also has a negative mental aspect because we're not getting the appropriate blood flow and repair in our brain. And then the third side of the triangle is exercise. Do we know how to move our bodies in order to make sure that the appropriate chemicals are being released, that we have a way to get rid of our stress, and that we are able to regulate our bodies in a way that doesn't allow us to fluctuate in terms of weight, in terms of blood pressure, in terms of breathing. And so we now have come to accept that as a country we're doing a better job at talking about mental health, but almost have forgotten the importance of physical health.
We went from one extreme to the other.
That is correct. And so it is really important that we combine those two and look at this holistically. So the H in health is really about how do we develop habits that will allow us to become both physically and mentally healthy over time.
Okay, so if you've gone through an experience that has exhausted you mentally, you're also exhausted physically, which means you have to get sleep to be able to deal with that?
Correct. And so, and let me also flip the sides on that. Let's flip the coin on that.
Okay.
So from a wellness standpoint, how do we get to a state of wellness? There are many opportunities for us to look at human development from a deficit, saying, well, if we don't do these things, that makes us sick. More recently, the focus has been, rightfully so, on if we do these things, this makes us well.
Right.
And it sounds like that's just words, that's just semantics, but it's bigger than semantics. Because if we're looking at, let me use food as an example for you.
Go for it.
If we're looking at, well, I shouldn't eat that because it's bad for me, that puts us in a negative state of mind, and it feels like we're punishing ourselves by not eating that.
Right.
But if we look at it, for example, as instead of that, I'm going to eat this thing because it fuels me better, then we've put ourselves in a positive state of mind.
Right.
And that's a big part of health process, is what state of mind are we in that we're building this positive self-image and this wellness, rather than we have to punish ourselves by taking away things that taste good.
Right. So putting yourself in kind of a negative space and like having a whole list of things that aren't good for you, it's already putting you in the space of like, I'm not doing something right. So switch the narrative to put yourself in a place of, I want to eat this because it's good for me.
Correct.
Okay.
And it's, whether we're talking about H in the arch specifically or arch as a whole, really what we're saying is this really is a conversation of, are we building resilience or are we reliving our trauma? And that's a really hard conversation, because you can get very quickly caught in a cycle of decision making that's as a result of the negative experiences you've had earlier in your life. But really building resilience is not erasing your bad experiences, because there is no erasing of trauma.
Right.
But what it is looking at it, viewing it for what it is, and then building anew over the top of it.
Got it.
And that really comes both from a mindset, but it comes from a physical change in your brain. And the fancy term is neuroplasticity, which means that until the day we die, our brain is constantly morphing and changing. And the more positive we can do for our brain in terms of those skills to build resilience, allows new neural connections to occur, which will make us healthier in terms of our mental health.
So arch as a whole can help one's brain knit these new connections. If you could summarize for us how all of those different concepts work together, how would you do?
Absolutely, and I think it's important because this can be a complex topic. What I would focus on is that arch is just one way to explain building resilience. There are other ways, and there is no proven model. But what we have found in our work with young people particularly, because most of my background is in K-12 education, is that it has to be something that's relatively easily explainable. And so if we look at arch, and we look at building attachment with the A, everyone benefits from a positive relationship in their lives. Love is the great equalizer. A scientist won't generally say that, but if you look at the data and the research that's been done, a loving relationship is the great equalizer in terms of building resilience. If you look at self-regulation, the ability to monitor one's own emotions and then have mechanisms or strategies to work with those emotions in a way that's socially acceptable and that's safe for those around us and for ourselves is really critical to being a young person. And then into adulthood, because we all know adults who aren't able to regulate their own emotions appropriately.
Yeah.
Competency is a way to build our self-esteem. What are we good at? What do we like to do? What are we passionate about? Self-esteem is a critical jumping off point to being a resilient person, because you're not going to fight really hard for something if you don't find yourself worthwhile. Right. And health is kind of what brings everything together. Your physical vessel, your health in terms of the base functioning of your body is really important, because nothing else works. None of these strategies, none of these concepts work if you're physically breaking down.
Right.
The nature of that H is really important, because our physical well-being allows us the opportunity to focus on other skills that help us be more resilient.
So resiliency is not just something you have. Everybody can work towards becoming more resilient and having a better peace of mind when it comes to dealing with big problems and challenges in life.
Yeah, I think you did a really nice job of explaining that. And the one thing I would be remiss if I didn't mention is another part of this work is that hopefully we become better as a society at not making people be so damn resilient in the first place. A lot of what we currently have set up in terms of our structures in society put people in situations where they have to be resilient. And so resilience is not just an individual thing, even though there is value in personal or individual resilience. there's also the resilience that is important for a community and for a neighborhood. And so when you create a safe and supportive environment in a school setting, for example, and then people are more likely to be able to heal from their trauma. And they're more likely to experience less trauma to begin with. Because the goal here is not only to help people be more resilient in facing their trauma, it's that they're facing less trauma to start with.
Altogether.
And that's a more proactive way. Now, we stop doing the resilience work to focus just on stopping the trauma? No,
Right. It has
because
to be together.
trauma is part of the human story.
Got it.
There is no human story without the obstacles that have been created by traumatic experience. That being said, we need to do a better job as the human community of creating less trauma for all human beings. So yes, this resilience, individual resilience, is part of that process, but part of that process is us working together as a community to limit the amount of obstacles and traumas that are happening on an everyday basis.
And wouldn't it be much, much harder if you were in those situations to be able to have the resources to work on the building blocks?
Correct. Correct. And access to resources is a major equity question. And it's also a question of how do we make those resources more available to everyone.
Wow. That's really cool. I learned a lot from you today. I think the two concepts that stood out to me most personally were the concepts of attachment and competency. I had been aware before that having a good community could be helpful, but I wasn't quite as aware of how important it is to the overall function of yourself and others, and also the concept of competency. Yes, self-worth helps with mental health a lot, but I thought it was just a really cool concept that even acknowledging something small you're good at could help you in the long run be a more confident person.
Yeah, and thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation. It's these conversations that lead to more knowledge, that lead to more understanding, and that really start moving us from myth to truth. And that's, I think, a big part of this work is for us to go outside of some traditional views of that resilience is just hard work, and the harder you work, the more resilient you are, and looking at all factors that impact our ability to be resilient people.
Joe, thank you so much for coming in to talk with me.
Thank you for having me today.
I learned a lot from watching Blythe's discussion with Joe. It's great to know that resilience is not a matter of luck. It's something that individuals and communities can develop over time. And Joe is right that conversations about mental health topics are the best way to get beyond old ideas and help ourselves and others. Please keep watching for a list of resources to learn more about resilience, and remember to look for opportunities to have your own good conversations. This is Dom signing off. We'll see you next time.